So pretend I'm doing this in like a like a Jerry Seinfeld voice. What's the deal with parrying?
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Jerry Seinfeld had a relationship with a 17-year-old high school. Why do I have to parry attacks in literally every video game now? Like, if you're playing an action game and you're holding a sword, you're gonna get a message in the tutorial that's like, and if you hit the block button at the exact moment an incoming attack lands, you'll perform a perfect parry. I'm like, I get it. Parrying, damn, it's kind of hard to say. Parrying. I don't know, there's something in there that kind of like trips me up. Probably should have thought about that before making a whole video on it, I guess. And like, I get it. Parrying is a thing in fighting. It's basically like when you're getting attacked, instead of just blocking, you can deflect the attack in a way that leaves your opponent vulnerable. I'm gonna write this sword off on my taxes. Given the fact that so many games are so combat-centered, it makes sense that parrying would be featured in a lot of games, but it wasn't always like this. So where does all of this parrying come from? Why is it so prominently featured in so many games? And why am I kind of tired of having to do it every single time I pick up a controller? I think the logical place to start is with that first question. When did we start to parry in video games? When it comes to sifting through gaming history, there are a lot of blind spots. Gaming as a medium is relatively new, but it's also old enough for a lot of historical information to just slip between our fingers, especially because of the way that gaming has been and sort of still is viewed. A lot of people just don't take it very seriously, so historical documentation on things is a little tough to come by. Peter, what are you talking about? What I'm trying to say here is that it's hard to find the first game that had parrying in it. At some point in my research, someone pointed me toward Prince of Persia, not the one with the legally different Jake Gyllenhaal, the first one from 1989.
I say I'm too late.
It's got sword combat in it, and parrying is a part of that. Look, it's even on its Wikipedia page. But it's hard to know if that was the very first game to have parrying in it or not. If you know of an older game with parrying, let me know in the comments, but 1989 was the earliest year I could point to for the mechanic. Either way, the point is that parrying has been around for a long time in gaming. In my professional opinion, despite being featured in games here and there like Prince of Persia in the late 80s, it wasn't a mechanic that had any sort of hold in most people's minds until it was widely popularized by fighting games, specifically Street Fighter, specifically again Street Fighter 3 in 1997. How parries worked in early fighting games, and in most of them still to this day, is that as an attack comes in, the player hits the parry button to completely negate all incoming damage. What separates a parry from a block, however, is that the person who parried is able to recover from the attack quicker than the attacker. It allows for the ebb and flow of combat to feel really fluid as players hand off being on the attack versus defense, really naturally. All it takes is one look at the most famous clip in the history of EVO to understand why parrying is such a solid mechanic for one-on-one fighting games. So obviously, to use a phrase, that shit's sick as fuck. And I totally get why it's such a staple of the fighting genre, but when I'm talking about parrying in modern gaming, I'm not talking about its place in Street Fighter or Tekken. Not just because I don't personally play those kinds of games, but also because it's a mechanic that's cemented into the genre and has been around since before this century even started. It would be like taking reloading out of modern shooters. Wait, Doom did that and it was amazing. Okay, bad example. I'm talking about the parrying in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Stellar Blade, the Resident Evil 4 remake, Metroid Dread, this kind of thing. Where does this come from? 2009, the year I was born. I'm just fucking with you, I was born in 1840. Anyway, in 2009, two extremely influential games came out. The first I want to talk about is Batman Arkham Asylum. Arkham Asylum is one of those games that I feel like a lot of people forget about when examining modern gaming trends and mechanics. I'd say mostly because its time of influence has sort of passed, but you can still see its fingerprints on a lot of modern games. There was kind of no reason for it to be as good as it was. It was a random Batman game made by a relatively untested studio, and there wasn't much expectation for it to be something of a masterpiece. It influenced a ton of other games with its excellent stealth mechanics and great translation of 2D Metroidvania elements into a 3D space. But it's the way that Arkham Asylum handled its combat using its parry system that made it truly influential. So, how the parry system worked in Arkham Asylum is kind of incredible. Basically, when an enemy is getting ready to attack you, you'll see a little bat symbol floating around their head, prompting you to hit the parry button, and you'll automatically defend yourself and start a counterattack against that enemy. Like in Street Fighter, the parry makes the flow of combat feel really fluid, but unlike Street Fighter, it takes very little skill and is completely busted and overpowered. That's not a criticism. That's actually what makes Arkham Asylum feel so good to play because, well...
Say the line, Bart!
Arkham Asylum makes you feel like you're Batman.
Here's the deal with the parry system in Arkham Asylum. Rocksteady didn't invent it. It's been in plenty of other action games before Arkham Asylum, but in my opinion, Rocksteady's refined version of it is what put the mechanic on the map. Sure, we can point to games that preceded Arkham Asylum, like Spider-Man 2, and say that it had roughly the same mechanic, but it's Arkham Asylum that influenced the likes of Sleeping Dogs, Shadow of Mordor, and even the recent Spider-Man games. As much of a hand as the original Spider-Man 2 had in shaping the design of Spider-Man PS4, Insomniac doesn't deny that Arkham Asylum was also a big influence. We're gonna get back to Batman in a little bit, but first, let's talk about the second majorly important game from 2009. Y'all ever heard of Demon Souls? I don't want to patronize anyone here and overstate what Demon Souls was at the time. When it came out, it was kind of misunderstood, since it was a very punishing game that launched in a time when gaming was sprinting in the direction of hand-holding and overbloated UI. A lot of people didn't like it, and it didn't sell incredibly well at first, but there was a hardcore audience for it who were able to appreciate it for what it was. That all said, I think it would be inaccurate to imply that Demon Souls was what popularized the parry mechanics that we see today, because I'd argue that Dark Souls, the game's successor, played a much bigger hand in that than Demon Souls. Demon Souls' parry mechanic is pretty similar to the one found in Dark Souls, but the game was a stepping stone for its popularity, not the thing that thrust it into every game that's ever been made between the years 2018 and now. So Demon Souls was highly influential, but not industry-wide. Its influence on Dark Souls, however, is going to be one of the tipping points for parrying becoming so widespread. While FromSoft was toiling away on the Dark Souls series, the entire games industry was focused on reusing the parry mechanic from Arkham Asylum. Like I said, games like Shadow of Mordor, Sleeping Dogs, Assassin's Creed, that Mad Max game that was pretty good, all used the same general parry mechanic. But here's the thing. While it's a really good system for many of the games it's in, it is a little simple, and with the way it's implemented in a lot of games, there's just not very much to it. There is some skill required with timing it out, but I think after a few years of the mechanic being in what felt like literally everything for a while, players were getting a little tired of it. As all that happened, FromSoft was becoming a premium studio following the success of Dark Souls. The influence of Dark Souls is a huge topic that I'm not going to even begin to try and unpack in full right here, but of the many, many things that stood out about the game, its parry mechanic took the world by storm. Because of how high risk, high reward parrying an enemy can be in a punishing game like Dark Souls, there was a huge rush of players trying to perfect the move. It was really flashy and shows mastery over the systems in the game, systems that are most known for kicking you in the dick. So watching someone absolutely obliterate a boss that, well, kicked you in the dick is a lot of fun. As the popularity of Dark Souls and FromSoft in general began to rise, so did communities of players who were devoted to showcasing their parrying skills. For example, here's a video from AGDQ 2018 where Dark Souls 3 runner SavvyTV successfully did a blindfolded fight against Pontiff Sullivan using 2 back-to-back parries. As time has crept forward, FromSoft has made its games with parrying front and center, like with Bloodborne's unique gun parry system, Elden Ring's new deflecting hard tier, and Sekiro's combat system, which is entirely based on parries and deflection. Because FromSoft is so influential, we've seen a lot of similar systems pop up in other games with a lot of iteration. Now, like Rocksteady's parry system in Arkham Asylum, FromSoft didn't create this type of parrying, but it did thrust it into the mainstream as FromSoft became more and more influential, so it's no surprise that other studios started following suit. While the parry style from Arkham Asylum had the gaming landscape in a chokehold for a while, I think that the higher skill ceiling for it, popularized by Dark Souls and then Bloodborne and then Sekiro, just ended up being more interesting to players and devs alike. This starts to creep into answering the question about why parrying is featured in so many games these days. In my opinion, it's the risk-reward system we talked about with Dark Souls. While it's cool to be an unstoppable fighting machine like in Arkham Asylum, that system doesn't really have a give and take since it's extremely simple to engage with. I mentioned earlier that the parrying in Arkham Asylum was a little overpowered. Again, that's the point of the whole system. But having an overpowered counterattack to just about everything a game is going to throw at you isn't particularly interesting when every game is doing it. There's nothing to be lost when using a parry like that. There's only benefit, there's no risk, so the reward is that much lower. Contrast that with the parrying in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, say. If you mess up a parry, you're gonna take a big hit to your health and be put even further on the defense. Parrying is a really useful tool in that game because it requires skill to be used properly. It's not just a win button. So it's that back and forth, that risk-reward, that's what makes the sword fights in Star Wars Jedi Survivor so interesting and satisfying, especially when playing on a higher difficulty, which I would recommend you do for that game specifically. We've understood why this system works for a long time in gaming. Y'all ever heard of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time? There's no parry system in that game, but there are 2 boss fights that are just a distilled version of the mechanic. It's the 2 times you fight Ganon, once in the Forest Temple against Phantom Ganon, and then once more in Hyrule Castle against, well, Ganon proper. The fights are really simple. You hit the projectiles, Ganon shoots at you, back at him, and they speed up as the fight goes on. As a kid, these fights made my heart pound because they leave you totally exposed if you make a mistake. It's the only move you have to fight back against Ganon, but because it feels so risky, it's so satisfying to properly do. On paper, parrying is a great mechanical idea because it asks players to put themselves at risk to get the upper hand in a combat encounter. That's why you see parrying pop up in games all over the place, like in Metroid Dread, God of War, Ghost of Tsushima, Tears of the Kingdom, to name just a few. But if it's such a good idea, then why am I so fucking sick of parrying enemy attacks in video games? The simple answer is because it's everywhere, in every game, completely and utterly inescapable, and perhaps most importantly, because not all games are created equal. Parrying can add a great risk-reward system to your game, but only if the rest of the game's systems are made such that fucking up a parry can have actual consequences. For example, I kind of sleptwalked my way through Stellar Blade earlier this year. It masquerades itself as a challenging Souls-like, but it's not really. Taking a hit from a poorly executed parry doesn't have the same weight as it does in something like Jedi Survivor or Sekiro, because Stellar Blade is incredibly forgiving, even on the harder difficulties. I feel the same way about the new Assassin's Creed games. Man, those things are really on both sides of the Dark Souls Arkham parry system, huh? They aren't made with the high-risk, high-reward system in mind, so when you just throw a single mechanic like that into the game, it just doesn't work really well with the rest of everything else going on. A recent episode of Design Delve addresses this exact problem, though in the video Jay's talking about different mechanics. He says,
"The biggest places we see this is in the perceived success of a certain game and the systems responsible for that success. And for an example, Breath of the Wild. It's a critical and commercial success, so game devs go, well, it must be the climbing mechanic, that's gotta be why, so they copy that one system verbatim without fully understanding the minutiae of why that mechanic worked within the context of the rest of its system."
So why is the parrying so good in something like Sifu? It's because the systems in the game surrounding the parrying are created to give the parrying weight and importance. There's real risk-reward to parrying properly in Sifu, since if you mistime it, you're getting your ass beat so hard you turn into an old man. The parrying in Resident Evil 4 Remake, by contrast, feels really tacked on to me. It doesn't introduce any new systems of consequence aside from knife degradation, but you cannot look me in the eyes and tell me that you think Resident Evil 4 needed weapon degradation to be remade for modern audiences. I think these two games are spectacular examples of how a game's parry system can either grab me or completely bore me, and it all comes down to considering the systems that surround it. As a result, the quality of a parry mechanic isn't black and white. Obviously, everyone is going to have their own thoughts on what parry systems work for each game based on their own preferences. As another example, I don't think the parrying in Stellar Blade works very well, but my taste for that specific system in that game doesn't exist in isolation. I think there are a lot of reasons why I don't like the combat in Stellar Blade, and the parrying is just one of the many reasons informing that opinion. The parrying itself feels alright to pull off, but because the game doesn't make a mistimed parry a problem for the player, the mechanic doesn't gel with the rest of the game properly. On the other side of things, I really like the way parrying works in Lies of P in harmony with the rest of its punishing combat, but I've also seen a lot of people say that they really don't like how the system works. So who's right? Me, because it's my video. I'm just kidding. I could spend a lot of time justifying those opinions, but I just don't think I need to. This isn't a Stellar Blade versus Lies of P comparison video. I'm just trying to point out that there's nuance to liking the system in different games. For me, the games where parrying really feels best are the ones that really nail the risk-reward concept that Ocarina of Time established. It doesn't need to be extremely punishing to work well, but it does need to make it so that a mistimed parry has real consequence. Parrying, as a mechanic, is so central to so many games right now, and I'm just a little over it. Again, it's not always bad. Lies of P recently showed me that it can still work as long as the systems in the game support it, and people who use the deflecting hard tier in Shadow of the Erdtree have told me that FromSoft still has the juice when it comes to parrying, but a game has to really commit to its parry system for me to feel like it's a worthy addition. That said, I don't think it should be removed from games entirely. Last year, I played through Star Wars The Force Unleashed, a game from the God of War dominating influence of the 2000s, and it doesn't really have a parry system. The absence is really felt because in a lot of situations, there's just no way to turn around a fight if you're getting washed. Some recent games have had interesting takes on parry systems that I really liked. Another Crab's Treasure, for example, doesn't have the player mash the block button the second an incoming attack lands to parry, but instead requires you to be inside your shell and release the block button when that attack lands. I know that sounds like a relatively small change, but it actually makes a really big difference in how it feels to play. Similarly, Nine Souls changes things up with its talisman system, requiring the player to parry an enemy in order to attach a damage-dealing talisman to them. One of the many reasons that Lies of P is so good, again in my opinion, is also because of its parry system that allows you to break an enemy's weapon if you perfect parry them enough. It takes a simple system for negating damage and lets it become a core part of strategizing against hard-hitting enemies. I think I'm just ready for the next shift in popular gaming mechanics. We've seen a lot of great new ideas over the last few years, and I'm hoping that some of them stick and take the reins away from parrying, like the building in Tears of the Kingdom. Given how long it takes for video games to be made, however, I think we're gonna be parrying enemies for a good while still. Parrying is all well and good, especially when done properly, but too many games have leaned too far into it without understanding what makes it such a great system in games like Sekiro and Lies of P. Let me leave you with this, the patron saint of absolutely unnecessary and uninteresting parry systems in gaming. Please enjoy my favorite game, Sonic Frontiers.
Okay, so I like legit do not understand why there's all this birthday stuff everywhere. Like there's like the UI is different and there's like presents and stuff, and Sonic's wearing a birthday hat and sunglasses. When I booted up the game, it was like, do you want to turn the birthday UI on? I was like, yeah, sure, what the fuck ever. And then now this has infected all of my save files and I can't turn it off. So you're just gonna have to make your peace with that. Anyway, the parry mechanic for this game is crazy. Basically, you just hold the left and right bumper, and while you're doing this, if you get attacked at any time, you can hold this infinitely. If you get attacked at any time, you just automatically repel an attack and then can just automatically kill the enemies. Like, check this out. Like, I'm just gonna hold this down, boom, hit the button prompt, they're dead. Hold this down, it also slows time down, it's kind of annoying. Boom, just instantly dead. Absolutely no thought required for this one. Completely uninteresting and uninspired. So thank you, Sonic Frontiers. This is a wonderful system you've created here.
Parrying is dead, and I think Sonic killed it. Like and subscribe.